Ladies and gentlemen, the time has come. Modern Warfare is here, and to celebrate, my friends over at G Fuel have boosted my discount code IMMORTAL up to 30% off. So if you are trying to stock up for the COD grind that is about to ensue, or you simply want to try G Fuel for the very first time, now is the best time to do so. And now on to the regular video. We have waited and waited and waited for this day for quite some time now, but for those of you who pre-ordered Modern Warfare, today is the day. The game is finally releasing, and we can all jump on and grind out a brand new year of Call of Duty content, with the campaign, multiplayer, and Spec Ops modes all offering up some really cool stuff this year. MW is taking a very different approach in a lot of areas of the game, and well, here's to hoping it pays off. But nonetheless, the new title is here, and you are probably wondering how you can improve your game, both performance-wise and also aesthetically, and just generally achieve the best settings right out of the gate. And today we're covering exactly that, as we're breaking down 9 settings that make a huge difference here in Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Before we jump into that though, today marks the start of an absolutely huge content season here on the channel, as we'll be covering everything there is to cover within MW. So if you are new here, or if you are a part of the 57% of viewers who are not subscribed, feel free to click that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. That way you can stay up to date with the latest Call of Duty news and intel. Also, if you enjoyed the video, let me know by dropping a like rating on it, as it would be much appreciated. And now let's get into some small settings in Modern Warfare that actually make a huge difference. So upon jumping into the game, you'll end up getting to mess around with your settings right away before you even try out any gameplay. So if you already have a solid idea of what settings you like to use in Call of Duty games, or you just like to go ahead and base your settings off of this video and then adjust them as needed, you are able to do so. That said, every player has their own preferences, so you'll probably end up tweaking some settings to your liking more than others. But through my playtime, by the end of the video, the list of things to mess around with should be a solid starting point for all kinds of players. First and foremost, let's start off with aim response curve type, as this is a setting that we've never seen before in Call of Duty, so you might be a little confused as to what this setting actually does. Basically, since the setting itself does not really provide a description of what it does, aim response curve type changes how your right analog stick feels when you move it. Here you have 3 options to choose from, that being standard, linear, and also dynamic. Standard is going to feel just like your average movement and response that we're used to in Call of Duty games. Linear makes the aim stick map directly to your aim rate, which in simpler terms just means that it's going to feel a bit more touchy when you move your right analog stick. And then dynamic is going to be the most fine-tuned aim rate control and provide for the most accurate reaction feeling when moving your thumbstick around. And thus, here I would honestly recommend trying out the dynamic style. It might take you a match or two to get used to, but I truly do think it helps out a lot with reactionary aiming. Admittedly, at first, I was pretty hesitant to change from the default of standard, since I really saw no reason to change a setting that I was already familiar with and comfortable with, but after changing it, I felt like the right analog stick movement felt a lot smoother and just more accurate overall. Now, while we are on the topic of aiming, it doesn't hurt to bring up stick sensitivity, which is even more in-depth than it was back in BO4. Not necessarily by a ton, but by enough at least that it's going to make a significant impact on your gameplay when you adjust it correctly. In Modern Warfare, we have 4 different settings when it comes to sensitivity, that being horizontal and vertical sensitivity, and also low zoom ADS sensitivity and high zoom ADS sensitivity. Now, the horizontal and vertical senses are completely based on your personal preference, in all honesty. For me, I personally rock a 6 horizontal and a 5 vertical, and I find that to be high enough that I'm able to flick around close range to lock on enemies who are near me, but in those longer range engagements, I'm not flicking around uncontrollably. Like I said though, personal preference is really what comes into play there. What is a bit more important though with sensitivity settings is the ADS adjustments you can end up making, as you can actually individually increase and decrease the high zoom and low zoom sensitivities to your liking. And this is going to refine your ADS speed, which means you're really able to have a much higher vertical and horizontal sense without having to sacrifice more precise aim while ADS'd. So here I like to dial my ADS sense down to 0.80 for both high and low zoom, which allows me to aim a bit more accurately based on my experience adjusting that speed. Speaking of aiming, let's talk aim assist. Man, my segues are on point today, if I do say so myself. Anyways, aim assist is obviously a pretty big deal in Call of Duty, and while you'll notice aim assist is a lot stronger in AI modes like the campaign, it does still exist in multiplayer, and this year once again we can customize it more than ever before. We end up having 4 settings here, including disabled, standard, precision, and also focusing, all of which feel pretty different from the last. Obviously, disabling aim assist is not going to be super helpful in most cases because it takes away the game's ability to help you lock onto enemies, so I would strongly advise against turning it off. Standard is what I personally like to use as it feels strong but not overwhelming, and it has that typical COD feel to it. Precision is apparently built for accurate players, but while trying this one out, I just didn't feel like it changed anything for the better compared to standard, so, why change it in that case? And honestly, the same deal went for the focusing option as well, which is specifically targeted for newer players. So honestly, personally, standard feels the most natural to me out of all of those. Moving on, the next in-game setting that I personally really like to have enabled is Depleted Ammo Weapon Switch, which, when enabled, automatically swaps your weapon when you completely run out of ammo with your primary. Keep in mind, this does not swap your weapon when you just have to reload, but rather when you have absolutely 0 bullets left in a certain gun, which could honestly save your life, all things considered. If you end up disabling this setting, if you were to run out of ammo, you would have to manually swap weapons, and if you don't swap quick enough, it could lead to your enemies taking you out, so from my personal experience, the safe bet here is to play with it on. Now, jumping over to some of the aesthetic settings, here we're basically aiming to make the game look as good as possible to provide for the most optimal experience. And thus, right away, I would suggest turning film grain all the way down to 0. Film grain essentially adds some sharpness and noise to the picture, which could create some unwanted visual particles in certain situations. Where I see this being the most prominent is when enemies are trying to hide in, say, a bush or some other shrubs, and if film grain is turned on in that situation, they might blend in a bit more than if it was actually turned off. So simply for visual clarity, no film grain is definitely the way to go. Also, while you're at it, I would recommend turning off motion blur for both the world and for your weapon as well. I feel like the example pictures here accurately display what motion blur does to your game, and in general, it is going to be a lot easier to spot enemies off in the distance or other certain pieces of information without any motion blur enabled, as obviously, whatever it is you can potentially see is not going to be blurry if motion blur is turned off. Pretty simple, but pretty significant nonetheless. Continuing on, let's talk about some audio settings because MW has quite a few, and here we're more so interested in audio volume and not so much audio presets, as those are a bit more dependent on your audio situation in specific, and frankly with the limited playtime that I've had on the game thus far, picking out the major changes between each preset is a bit difficult. Regardless, outside of your audio mix, you have 4 other settings to change, that being master volume, music volume, dialogue volume, and also effects volume. So with these, master volume, honestly, I would just keep that at 100. If that is too loud for you, you can always turn down your speakers or your headsets, or if need be, you can turn it down, but really I see no reason to not have the audio broadcasted as loud as it can be when you can just adjust it elsewhere. For music volume, personally, I like to have this one on the lower end, at least low enough that it doesn't distract me from playing, but not too quiet so that I'm just sitting in silence on the main menu. Dialogue volume I also keep lowered simply because I don't need the announcer yelling at me every time something happens in game, and I would rather focus on audio information like gunfire and footsteps instead. Speaking of gunfire and footsteps and all things of that nature, that's where effects volume comes into play, and seeing as that's really the most important audio intel you can get, I keep effects volume maxed out as well. Next up, network settings are especially important when optimizing your gameplay experience, as a bad connection can seriously ruin the game outright. That said, network settings can get pretty complex, so in the interest of time, I'll just give you the short version of the speech. But basically, playing on a hardwired connection is always going to be the most optimal, that way you can have the strongest connection in game. But if that is not an option for you, playing on a 5 GHz Wi-Fi network is going to be more optimal than a 2.4 GHz network, as that is going to provide a much stronger connection as well, not necessarily as good as being hardwired in most cases, but pretty solid nonetheless. You also want to shoot for having an open NAT type, which will allow you to connect to the most lobbies possible with the strongest connection possible too. If you don't have an open NAT, you can always try enabling UPnP on your router or doing some port forwarding, which is definitely something you'll want to look up if you are not too familiar with it. Then finally, the last setting that we have here for today that'll make a huge difference in game is Crossplay. Crossplay, when turned on, opens up your lobby pool by a pretty significant amount as it extends to both of the other platforms for matchmaking, but only via input. I still see a ton of concern about console players having to play against PC players, and yes, console can play against PC, but if you are using a controller on console, you'll only play against other controllers on PC. If you're using a keyboard and mouse on console for whatever reason, you'll play against keyboarders on PC. Unless you have someone in your party using a mouse and keyboard while you are using a controller, you as a controller player should not come across keyboarders in-game. Input-based matchmaking pretty much prevents that, and thus crossplay really doesn't harm your experience as it only increases the amount of lobbies you can get into, and theoretically that should provide you with a more stable connection as well. So with all of that being said, there you guys have it. Those are a handful of settings here in COD MW that ultimately should have a pretty significant impact on your game. If you found the video helpful or you just simply enjoyed it, let me know. Drop a like rating on it as it would be much appreciated. And of course, if you are new here and you want to stay up to date with everything going on in the world of Call of Duty, ranging from news to leaks to updates and pretty much everything else in between, feel free to subscribe with your post notifications turned on. That way you'll always know when I post a new video. As I mentioned in the intro, from now until the 29th, my G Fuel code IMMORTAL will get you 30% off your entire order, so if you do want to snag any G Fuel products, now is definitely the best time to do so. Once again, thanks so much for tuning in, and until next time, take it easy, have an awesome rest of your day, and I'll see you guys on the battlefield. Peace out.